You are listening to episode 63 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Erik Storlie speaks with us about his online article, Lineage, Delusions, Edo Shimano Roshi, Dharma Transmission, and American Zen. Many of us got our start in Buddhism and meditation with reading books, and from there we sought out a local center, find some community, develop a relationship with a teacher, and often this blossoms into a strong, vibrant, beneficial journey on the path of awakening. Religious organizations are made up of people, including teachers, and as people, as human beings, they are prone to making mistakes, concealing their faults from others and even from themselves. We sometimes think that this is a problem of other institutions, that our mindfulness, and surely that of a renowned and trusted teacher, makes us and our leaders immune from such problems. This is wrong. Recently, an article was posted on Sweeping Zen that talked about some of the problems that can be inherent with religious lineages. This article came to my attention, and I knew that the author's name was familiar. Of course, we were acquainted through a shared association here in Minnesota, and I was delighted that he was willing to come speak with us about it. Dr. Erik Storlie began a practice of sitting meditation in 1964 with Shunryo Suzuki Roshi. After Suzuki's death in 1971, he studied with Dainin Katagiri Roshi until 1983, helping to found the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center in 1973. For the last 15 years, he has led retreats and given instruction in meditation, assisting students to develop mastery of meditation practice without reference to a particular religious form. Erik earned his Master of Arts in English from the University of California, Berkeley, his Bachelor of Arts in English, and PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. His dissertation, Grace and Works, Discipline and Enlightenment, was a cross-cultural study of awakening experience in Puritanism and Zen. His publications include Nothing on My Mind, Berkeley LSD 2 Zen Masters, Asking Good Questions, Getting Good Writing, A Teacher's Handbook, Zen on Ice, Earth's Original Face, and Sawtooth Sesshin. Erik retired from full-time college teaching in English, Composition, and Humanities in 2000. He currently leads retreats and teaches meditation and mindfulness for the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. So sit back, relax, and have a nice golden retriever punch. There isn't such a thing that I know of, but someone should invent it. And we are here with Erik Storlie. Erik, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, a pleasure to be here.
So normally, as listeners of the podcast know, I start each interview by asking the person that I'm speaking with about their background, but this time we're going to be a little different. We're going to table that for another interview with Erik that will come at a later date on his book, Nothing on My Mind, Berkeley LSD 2 Zen Masters, and Life on the Dharma Trail. So instead today, one of the things we're going to talk with Erik about is an article that he wrote that I posted on the Facebook fan page for the Secular Buddhist podcast called Lineage, Delusions, Edo Shimano Roshi, Dharma Transmission, and American Zen. So the link can be found on the webpage for this episode for people who are listening. Erik, if you would, tell us a little bit about the background of what led you to write this article. What was it that was happening?
Well, what really moved me to write the piece, it's something I've thought about over many years and had many discussions with people in the Zen community about, was the New York Times article that outlined the scandal that developed when it became clear that Robert Aiken, as early as the 60s, had hidden the toxic behavior, if not criminal behavior, of Shimano. And that, of course, shook the American Zen community simply because Shimano had gone on to abuse women for 4 decades after Aiken had essentially set aside this information and chose to let Shimano go forward. Mm-hmm. So this reminded me, of course, of my own experience through the 60s and 70s, where I saw Trungpa Rinpoche abuse people. Richard Baker had a meltdown at the San Francisco Zen Center that related, of course, to this kind of power abuse, sexual abuse. We had the scandals here at the Minnesota Zen Center with Katagiri Roshi and a number of his Dharma heirs, which you can explore, or people can explore, in Natalie Goldberg's book, The Great Failure. Mm-hmm. So it's been an ongoing story in American Zen, and a disturbing one. So to see I thought of it as kind of an Egypt moment when the ability of the web to put this information about Aiken's correspondence that only recently had been made available, he had opened that correspondence, as I understand it, because of his contact with Kobutsu Malone, who had urged him to unseal before his death this material. And he did that just days before he died. Mm-hmm. And I see a recent Tricycle has an interview with Aiken that was done just as Malone was there getting the papers unsealed and shortly before Aiken died. And in that interview, Aiken, when asked about Shimano, simply says, he's a crook. Mm-hmm. He's a crook. Repeats it several times. Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that finally the American Zen community, if it's going to be viable and of any use in this country, has to address this.
Yeah. I think we see this not just in our own Zen communities, our own Buddhist communities, but we see this in other religions and other organizations. Anything where we have a hierarchical structure that can lend itself to situations of abuse often results in that kind of abuse.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, one of the things that you had said in your article, which I have here, is that, and just speaking specifically on Dharma transmission, that the doctrine of Dharma transmission hangs on 4 overlapping assumptions, all of which must be true to establish its credibility. The first 2 are beyond proof, and the 3rd and 4th are obviously false. Could you tell us a little bit about what those 4 overlapping assumptions are?
Well, you can help me on this because I haven't looked at the article again. Oh, I see you.
Conveniently, I've printed it out, so we're taking a look, and they're marked.
Yeah. So I'll read a little of this, but we can go back and forth on each one. The first assumption is that the historical Buddha attained a mind of absolute perfection, and that this Buddha mind was something that could be transmitted from one disciple to the next all the way through history down 2,500 years, and a current person at an American Zen Center who has his papers stamped, has the mind of the Buddha. My comment here is simply that we'll never know about this. It's the notion of the Buddha's perfect enlightenment is a wonderful notion, beyond proof. It's to me, it touches if we look at it from a scientific point of view, the wonder of having brains that have 100 billion neurons, as the neuroscience people tell us, each neuron in connection possibly with up to 20,000 other neurons.
Right.
So at that point we have possibilities that are astronomical, infinite. We're talking infinities. Yeah. So this first notion is let's say a spiritual notion that simply tells us the magnificence of what's possible for us.
You know, on the skeptical side, we're often accused of taking out anything inspirational and setting it aside. And that's one of the things that I'm constantly struggling with, because we are inspired by our wonderful stories. It's not to say that that can't be wonderful and helpful to us in our practice. It is, absolutely. Where the danger is what comes out of the presumption that that is a hard and tangible truth to be adhered to. That's where we can lead into other things like the rest of the 4 points. Let's move on.
Like hierarchy.
Yeah.
Well, just before I go there, as Einstein said, the impulse in science is the same impulse that's in art, which is the same impulse that's in religion, which is appreciation of the wonder and beauty of existence. Mm-hmm. Well, the second presumption is that the Buddha's disciple Mahakāssyapa attained this perfect mind, that the Buddha recognized it, and this, of course, depends upon the first assumption. So these two steps are simply a matter of conjecture, interest, I'd say poetry and metaphor. I think once we move from the notion that these are poetic ways to express the possibilities of our human life, then we're in trouble. It's like saying, well, the world is 5,000 years old. We read the Old Testament and Genesis, and then we say, well, this has to be history. Mm-hmm. This has to be science. The third point is simply that there has been such a chain of transmissions for 2,500 years, mind to mind, disciple to disciple. And as Edward Kanze, the great scholar of Indian Buddhism, said, much of this was just made up by the Chinese and the Tang dynasty. None of it's true about the Indian history. It's arguable in many cases throughout the whole chain. And given the some of the problems of people we know in our lives who are claiming to be Dharma transmittees, they don't pass the sniff test. They're not behaving like beings who have perfected minds. We have a problem with that doctrine, and that doctrine, of course, in American Zen has been the basis for very powerful hierarchical structures and authority that has been severely abused. Virtually every Zen center that I'm aware of has had problems with this kind of, with abuse that I would say is in part deeply rooted in the creation of a false hierarchy and a false authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that leads to the question that's the dark side that we face and that we have had historically over time. And I will say that as we were chatting before the interview, I went through my lay ordination here at the Zen Center, and one of the things that, the physical things that came out of that is I had a lineage paper, I had a little packet, which had all the way from Buddha through all the way, and there were hundreds of names on here, all the way down to Katagiri Roshi of the full lineage. And I looked at this is very interesting. And it's a piece of paper like any other, and it can be inspiring. and to see that, so there has been some, if we view transmission as a teaching that has been shared, cool, I can get with that, that's fine. If we look at it as, no, this was a mystical kind of glowing thing that went from one brain to the next, and here's the historical document to prove it, it doesn't prove anything. That does not cut the necessary requirements for being evidence of such a thing.
Yeah.
So, setting aside what we have been facing, you also say that meaning is available. Above all, the penetrating explorations into the mysteries of consciousness we undertake in meditation and yoga. And the most important thing we can bring to these inquiries, and to those we hope to further in these inquiries, is our sincerity and our selflessness. So the question is, how do we make that change? What do we do to, in a way, legitimize our teachers? Because we, as people who are looking to get some guidance, need to know where to go. And I frequently get people writing in saying, where can I go? Can you recommend some teachers? Like, well, what are you looking for? Is one of the questions. What do you want to get out of this? So how do we change things such that there is a kind of authentication of who would be a teacher with whom we should study?
I think it's a very difficult question, but a question that has been solved in most areas of human experience. So, ranging from, we know how a Lutheran pastor is made. We can look at it, we can study the curriculum, we can examine who the examiners are of a Lutheran pastor. The same goes for a Catholic priest. Now, this doesn't guarantee anything. It's like my PhD. It didn't guarantee my morality, my ethics, my intelligence about anything beyond a certain area. However, it has value insofar as it is definable and demonstrable as something that others could look at and decide, should I give this guy a teaching job? Should I give this guy, in the case of a religious teaching, should he stand up in front of a Lutheran church? Now, this has been done and can be done in American Zen. The problem right now is that no one is capable really of defining what the curriculum is, nor is there a body that could authorize teachers based on that curriculum. And I think there is currently great resistance, because to do that you've essentially thrown out this tradition in the Zen path of Dharma lineage. And if you look at that in Japan, in China, then it was definable in the same way that a Lutheran pastor is definable. So Katagiri Roshi became a Dharma heir by spending time with his master, by going to Komazawa University, by being approved by a whole culture of older men who could observe him and finally give him his stamp of approval. That does not exist right now in America. In Japan, my guess is that by and large, many Japanese, both within the Zen priesthood and within the lay community, know perfectly well that the priest who is a Dharma transmittee is in many other ways an ordinary fellow. Much less mystique about that than we had from the 60s, where these strange Asian mystery men came over and we were wowed, and we tended to buy a lot of the mystique. So how can that happen? That will be a struggle, I think, if it's not done in some way that defines what a Zen teacher is in some reliable and testable way. Then we will continue to have these abuses. We will have people who Well, you consider the category Lineage. He was taken ill. He died much sooner than anyone expected. He named a dozen or close to a dozen lineage holders. Would he have done that had he lived 10 more years? Who knows? There might have been someone completely different who would be his sole lineage holder. Or in the case of Suzuki Roshi, sick early, surprise, names Richard Baker. Doesn't work out. So as long as a credential is entirely based on the pleasure of one person, then the door is open for really craziness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say that very clearly here, is that no meaningful credential can be conferred simply at the pleasure of one person. That you're essentially, you talk about, and you do this quite eloquently in the article, so I won't read the whole thing. Be sure people who are listening to the podcast, go read the article for yourself. That you talk about the idea that your motivations change, that you, instead of going after a teaching and a depth of learning and practice, you become interested in satisfying the teacher's needs, that individual's, because you have that goal of receiving transmission. You yourself were offered Dharma transmission, and you declined. Tell us about that.
Well, I was offered the opportunity to do by a friend who was a Dharma holder, the opportunity to do some work with him, and it was quite clear that I wasn't going to go back to school. We both had equal amount of practice and work, and I think this was a kind of courtesy to say, well, okay, if you don't get this credential, no one will pay attention to you. You'll be in the dark. But I could not do that because I considered it a false credential. I considered it for a day thinking, well, yeah, maybe. But then thought, no. It would be dishonest. It would be dishonest. It would be like becoming a Catholic priest when I don't think that Jesus Christ was divine. It's no integrity there. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So,
and I know that's been a struggle for many of us who have more secular inclinations, that really there isn't a set track for us to follow for any sort of recognition of what we've done in terms of study and practice.
Yeah.
Because we don't have that set up at this time, and that's something that is being discussed, and how do we do that, and one of the important things that comes up is, what's the definition? what is it that we're attesting to? And certainly I think the idea that it not be done at the whim of an individual is critical.
Yeah. That
there needs to be some sort of group review and set of standards, that you take the personal buy-ins and agendas out of the equation. There needs to be something that we set that aside. When you're talking about the getting of that credential, my mind flashed to the Wizard of Oz and the Scarecrow getting his diploma, and that's what made the difference. Is now you have a diploma, and it really, there's just something magical about the piece of paper. It doesn't transform you in a mysterious way. You're either thinking or you're not, and he shows throughout in the entire book that he's a thinker.
Well, we see the dilemma in that had Katagiri sadly been cut down by his disease in an even more untimely fashion, he would have left no Dharma heirs. Mm-hmm. And then everybody would have had to go seek another teacher, become their courtier. As I point out in the essay, when you've got this kind of one person can make you into a Dharma heir, you have a court-like situation where the king or the queen has immense power, and those who that person favors are in the middle of the community and feel fully rewarded. They know, however, if they displease that person, they may lose their opportunity. Mm-hmm. So I've seen a lot of very toxic behavior, both in Zen centers with people gravitating towards someone who is a Dharma heir, whom if that person, pardon me, I'll back up, and if that person didn't happen to be a Dharma heir, they would not have a wish to spend much time with
that power, that draw wouldn't be there because
sure.
they don't have the diploma.
Yeah, that is a huge problem. Mm-hmm. I've seen interesting responses to this piece. One of them is, well, all licenses are dubious anyway. So if you get a PhD, you might be a jerk, and it doesn't matter then. You always have to be skeptical of a license or a credential. Well, that's not true if you have a credential that even if my thesis advisor had been run over by a truck, there were half a dozen other men and women who I was working with, and I would have gone on and continued.
And there were standards set for you.
Sure.
Yeah.
The other one is, well, it's the old tradition of, the medieval tradition of craftspeople. So you've got a shoemaker, and he teaches his son or the neighbor boy to make shoes, and he can finally say, you make good shoes, go and make shoes, open your own shop.
Yeah.
The huge difference here, though, is that the consumer can look at the shoe and see if it falls apart or
Exactly.
not.
If the shoe falls apart, you know, he's a sucky shoemaker.
Yeah.
You don't go to this cobbler.
But now we have a mystique. If you have a mystique about the shoemaker, well, the reason the shoe fell apart was to teach you to beware of bad shoemaking. Well, you know, so then
thank you, wise cobbler, for giving me crappy shoes.
Yeah, so I would, or I would walk more carefully, or...
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a risk with anything where there is not a tangible product that is being conveyed. With a cobbler, we can see the shoes fall apart.
Yeah.
There's nothing to it. With this, we can look at behaviors and not make excuses for them. What we run into often is they're pushed aside, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, or they're ignored as a teaching. There's an excuse that's made out for them, and that only occurs when we have this adherence to something which allows us to shut off our reasoning.
Yeah.
And not pay attention to things really we should be paying attention to, which is one reason I keep going back to critical thinking is an important part of this whole experience. That one of the things that meditation, I have found, helps support is stopping, taking a step back, looking at this, including outside of our own frame of reference that we're always in. We can't ever get completely out of this, but we can help ourselves put the brakes on and ask ourselves, are we really looking at this more clearly than otherwise we would be? One of the things that, as you were speaking about the whole idea of we have individual teachers that are on a whim, they have their magic wand or the mountain seat or the whatever the particular ritual is to convey this intangible validation. We also have people who they have a goal of becoming a priest.
Yeah.
For various reasons. And some of this is they come from a background where this was their trajectory and there were ideological differences. And it still may be perfectly valid that they continue in that vein with an ideology that is one which resonates more with their personal character. There's nothing wrong with that. Where I have seen some challenges is where people are going after getting their robes because they want their robes.
Yeah.
And oddly, in some circumstances, they get their robes and yet still don't model the behavior which would indicate you should be wearing these robes.
Yeah.
And I know in the in the Pali, there's a story about someone who was going to see if Buddha himself really was he worthwhile teaching. I'm going to watch this guy and see what he's about. And really, the behavior itself showed, okay, this is a person who really is modeling the behavior. And again, this is an inspiring story. Are we going to know it's true or not? No, but there's something to be learned from this. What do we see in the behavior?
Yeah.
Now, we can always look at the idea that, well, how bad would they be without teaching a meditation? Again, we're never going to know that. So we can only go based on what we see. So it is important for people who are looking for teachers to do your homework and to be critical and to really make some observations and see what you're seeing in the behavior, not just the, well, I have lots of students, or I've got lots of Dharma errors.
Well, there's an old story, I think, in the Jewish tradition about the Alasudis. So the young man is studying with the great Rebbe and finally says, well, I want to go see this other great Rebbe. And the old man says, well, yes, you go see this other great Rebbe. Pay particular attention to how he ties his shoes. So the notion that it's just the very simple behavior that will tell you a great deal about the spiritual advancement of an individual. Mm-hmm. And I think sincerity is the key. Yeah. Are you observing someone who is really getting off on the power and the adulation? Yeah. Is this a person who, as I remember Shunryu Suzuki did at the Zen Center in the early days when it was time for sweeping and clean up, he would often have a broom and he would sweep and clean up. Mm-hmm. So that you can look at very simple human virtues like mm-hmm. humility, sincerity, honesty, and then if that isn't there, but the message is this is such a great personage mm-hmm. that we should not expect that, then the bullshit detector should start vibrating.
I see that every time I watch any debates between, say Sam Harris and Michael Shermer and Deepak Chopra. Because the people who get angry during that debate, who really lose it, it's Deepak Chopra.
Yeah.
The other. It's not the others. And I see this man who, espouses these virtuous states of mind that he's not demonstrating. He's on stage in front of 1,000 people, and you see him just getting increasingly upset. One time I was headed to a particular place for a weekend retreat. It was early morning, and I was headed towards the particular facility. And one of the people who was one of the priests, one of the hierarchy people, and I were both headed towards the back door. And as we got to the back door, they turned to me and said, because they didn't know me, they didn't know I'd been coming here many years, and I'd been a Doan for many years. I said, you should use the other door.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay. So I went around and used the door for the second class citizens.
Right.
And that in itself was very telling about that the particular individual and where they were in their exercise of we're all connected and we're all the same. And what I continued to observe over a period of time really supported that. Yeah. So it can be the small things that get supported over time. And hopefully we grow and we change, because people can change and they can grow. And that's the kind of thing that we do want to encourage.
Yeah. Well, it's a good analogy is music. Mm. If you have a violin master, at some point an entire audience can judge how your violin sounds. Mm-hmm. With meditation, of all things, to look at a person sitting in silence, I can feel something very deep at times, mm-hmm. but, I really don't know much about the character. Mm-hmm. And I've been tricked. I've seen people sit in what seems like deep repose, but after I learn more about them, I realize that they must have been having many sexual thoughts, indeed many sexually predatory thoughts, given what they manifested in the world.
Yeah.
But they could still sit long sessions in deep repose.
I heard one priest tell me, "Yep, I can sit still with the best of them."
Yeah. Or as another old friend said about San Francisco Zen Center, well, many of us just slept in the Zendo, by which he meant we avoided the world. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting passage in the Upanishads where the comment is, if those who do nothing but meditate go to hell, those who never meditate, who are only in the world, go to a hell. Those who do nothing but meditate go to a worse hell. This is a radical paraphrase. Maybe it's in the Bhagavad Gita. I'd have to chase the quote.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we do this practice. Hopefully, we end up seeing positive changes in who we are and how we interact with others. And this is one of the things that was I think a criticism of the earlier, and one of the breaks between the Mahayana tradition and the Theravada tradition is, well, this needs to be taken out into the world. There's an adherence to this teaching and dogma, and we chant every weekend in Zen centers about form and emptiness, and you need to not attach Sariputta to things, because he was the right-hand man who was the guy who knew the doctrine really well, and he was sort of made into the fall guy in the Mahayana tradition about you need to bring it into the world too. Erik, thank you much for being here. I'd like to mention to people who are listening that your website, you can be found at http://beginnerzen.com. Again, Erik Storlie. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on the Secular Buddhist.